Jake McCready stood at his kitchen window, black coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching strangers in $1,000 suits walk his sacred ground like they already owned it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pasture where his grandfather had taught him to rope, where his father had died saving cattle from a lightning fire, where he'd buried 3 dogs and sworn he'd never leave. But the oil beneath his boots was worth more than his memories, and the vultures knew it. The knock came at dawn, sharp and insistent against the old oak door. Jake had been up since 4, same as every morning for 37 years, but something felt different in the air, a tension that made his cattle restless and his instincts prickle. "Mr. McCready?" The woman on his porch wore a tailored suit that cost more than most folks' trucks, her smile too bright for the early hour. Behind her stood a thin man with nervous eyes, clutching a briefcase like a lifeline. "I'm Victoria Sterling from Meridian Energy Corporation." Jake's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. He'd heard that name whispered in town, seen the black SUVs creeping along county roads, mapping and measuring what wasn't theirs to map. "We're not selling," he said, starting to close the door. $15 million. The words stopped him cold. "That's just our opening offer for the mineral rights. You'd keep the land, Mr. McCready. You keep your home." The numbers echoed in his head as he watched her eyes, predator eyes, patient and hungry. 15 million would solve every problem he'd ever had. Would pay off the ranch debts, fix the roof his grandfather had patched a dozen times, maybe even bring his daughter back from the city where she'd fled after Sarah died. "You've got 5 minutes, he said, stepping aside. Victoria Sterling smiled wider. "That's all I need." But as she spread contracts across his kitchen table, the same table where 4 generations of McCreadys had eaten their last meals before heading out to work land that might not be theirs much longer, Jake felt something twist in his gut that had nothing to do with morning coffee. The thin man cleared his throat. "There's just one small complication. Your neighbor to the south, Mr. Garrett, he's been difficult about access rights." Jake's blood went cold. Tommy Garrett. The name alone was enough to bring back the taste of dust and the sound of his best friend's voice saying goodbye 20 years ago, right before Jake's testimony sent him to prison for rustling cattle that maybe, just maybe, Tommy never stole. Victoria Sterling was still talking, her voice honey-sweet with promises of wealth beyond imagination. But Jake's eyes had found the window again, looking out at land that suddenly felt as fragile as morning frost. "I need time to think," he said, though he knew thinking was the last thing these people wanted him to do. As their car disappeared down his dirt road, Jake noticed something that made his chest tighten. Tire tracks in the mud by his gate, fresh ones that hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had been watching his place, waiting for the right moment to strike. The game had already begun, and he was 3 moves behind. By noon, Jake's phone had rung 17 times. Word traveled fast in a county where secrets lasted about as long as morning dew, and everyone from his banker to his barber wanted to know if the rumors were true. $15 million. In a place where that kind of money could buy half the town. He was checking fence posts on the south pasture when he saw the dust cloud rising from the direction of the Garrett place. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the rifle scabbard on his saddle, muscle memory from a time when the line between neighbors could shift with the seasons and a man's word was the only law that mattered. The rider coming toward him sat his horse like he'd never left the saddle, despite 20 years behind bars. Tommy Garrett looked older, harder, with gray threading through his black hair and lines carved deep around eyes that had once laughed at Jake's jokes. "Heard you got visitors this morning," Tommy said, reining in his horse 20 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to run. News travels fast, faster when it involves oil money and old friends. Tommy's smile held no warmth. "Funny thing, Jake, these same company men came to see me yesterday. Offered me $2 million for access rights across my land. Jake felt the first real stab of fear, not for himself, but for what was coming. Tommy, 20 years I sat in that cage, thinking about this land, about friendship, about truth. Tommy's voice was steady, but his horse sensed the tension, sidestepping nervously. You know what I figured out in all that time? The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Truth's like oil, Jake, slippery, hard to hold on to, but it always finds a way to the surface. A hawk circled overhead, its cry cutting through the afternoon heat. Jake watched Tommy's hand rest casually on his thigh, inches from the pistol Jake knew he carried. Some habits died hard. If you're thinking about taking their money, Tommy continued, you might want to remember that some wells run dry, but some grudges, they got a way of lasting forever. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear as summer lightning. Tommy wheeled his horse around and rode back toward his own land, leaving Jake alone with the wind and the growing certainty that $15 million might cost him everything he'd ever truly valued. That evening, Jake found his prize bull lying dead in the south pasture. No obvious cause, no sign of struggle. Just gone, like someone had flipped a switch. The vet would call it natural causes, but Jake knew better. The war had begun, and he was losing ground with every sunset. The courthouse steps felt the same under Jake's boots as they had 20 years ago, worn smooth by the weight of justice and injustice in equal measure. Tommy was already there, waiting in the shade of the oak tree where they'd carved their initials as boys, back when the world was simple and friendship was forever. Didn't think you'd show, Tommy said without turning around. Told you I would. A lot of promises got broken on these steps. Tommy's voice carried the weight of 2 decades spent in cages, counting days and nursing grudges. Question is, you here to break another one or finally keep one that matters? Jake pulled out the paper Victoria Sterling had prepared, a legal document admitting to perjury, clearing Tommy's name, and opening the door to the biggest oil deal in county history. His signature would make them both rich men, but wealth wasn't what this was about anymore. Before I sign this, Jake said, I need you to know something. That night, I saw them do it. Henderson's boy and his crew. I saw them drive your cattle onto your land. Tommy finally turned around, and Jake saw something he hadn't expected in those weathered features. Not surprise, but a deep, bone-tied sadness. I know. You ... what? You think I didn't recognize the look in your eyes during the trial? Hell, Jake, I knew you better than my own shadow back then. Tommy sat down heavily on the courthouse steps. I kept waiting for you to speak up. Every day of that trial, every night in that cell, I kept thinking, tomorrow Jake's gonna tell them what he saw. Tomorrow he's gonna come through. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. And why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell them I was there? Because I was protecting you, you damn fool. Tommy's laugh was bitter as winter coffee. You think I wanted my best friend to go down for perjury? You think I wanted Sarah to lose her man over my bad luck? Jake sank down beside his oldest friend, the paper crumpling in his shaking hands. 20 years of guilt? 20 years of what-ifs and might-have-beens. And the truth was simpler and more terrible than he'd ever imagined. I should have been stronger, Jake whispered. Yeah, you should have. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, watching clouds drift across the courthouse dome. But I should have trusted you enough to tell you what I knew. Should have given you the chance to be the man I thought you were. The silence stretched between them, filled with the ghosts of choices that couldn't be undone and roads that couldn't be untraveled. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled noon, marking another moment in a day that would change everything or nothing, depending on the weight of his signature on a piece of paper. Sign it, Tommy said suddenly. Jake looked up, surprised. Tommy, sign it, take the money, save your ranch. Tommy stood up, dusting off his jeans with hands that trembled just slightly. But not for me, not for the past. Do it because Sarah would have wanted you to be whole again, and maybe this is the only way. Jake's pen hovered over the signature line, the weight of 20 years pressing down like a storm front. In the distance, he could see Victoria Sterling's car waiting, ready to turn their confession into profit, their pain into power. But as he signed his name, Jake McCready finally understood something his grandfather had tried to teach him long ago. Sometimes the only way to save your soul is to stop trying to save your secrets. The deed was done. The truth was free. And for better or worse, there was no going back. The oil derricks rose from Jake's south pasture like steel prayers against the evening sky, their rhythmic pumping a heartbeat that would echo through his dreams for whatever time he had left. The $15 million sat in his bank account, a number too large to feel real. But the emptiness in his chest was as familiar as morning coffee. Tommy had taken his share of the settlement and disappeared the day after the signing, leaving only a note that said, "Some roads are better traveled alone." Jake understood. He'd been traveling alone for 20 years, even when Sarah was alive, even when the ranch was full of hands and hope. He was sitting on his porch, watching the sunset paint the derricks gold, when his daughter's car pulled up to drive. Emma stepped out slowly, like she was approaching a wild animal, her city clothes and careful makeup making her look like a stranger in the place where she'd been born. "Daddy." Her voice was softer than he remembered, touched with something that might have been forgiveness. "I saw the news. About Tommy. About what really happened." Jake nodded but didn't trust himself to speak. Emma had been 17 when her mother died, 18 when she left for college and never came back except for Christmas visits that grew shorter every year. She'd inherited Sarah's stubborn streak and Jake's moral compass, which meant she'd always seen through his carefully constructed explanations about the past. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, settling into Sarah's old rocking chair like she'd never left. "Because some truths are too heavy for children to carry." Jake's voice was rougher than he intended. "And by the time you were old enough, I'd been carrying it so long I forgot how to put it down." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the oil pumps work their mechanical magic. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Jake remembered teaching Emma to howl back when she was small, before the world got complicated and friendships got broken, and good men learned to live with their mistakes. "The ranch is yours now," he said eventually. "Oil money set aside for maintenance, improvements, whatever you need. You can sell it, keep it, do whatever feels right." Emma turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the dying day. "What are you going to do?" Jake pulled out a letter from his shirt pocket, worn soft from reading and rereading. Tommy's forwarding address in Montana, a small ranch where broken men could find work and maybe, if they were lucky, a little peace. "Don't want to finish a conversation that's 20 years overdue." He handed her the ranch deed, signed and notarized, her name written in his careful script. "And maybe learn how to travel that lonely road Tommy talked about." Emma took the papers, but didn't look at them. "He forgave you, didn't he?" "Tommy? I think so. But forgiving yourself, that's a different kind of work." The oil derricks kept pumping steady and sure, pulling wealth from the ground that would outlast them all. But Jake McCready was thinking about Montana sky and second chances, about friendship and redemption and the long road between mistake and mercy. Tomorrow he would pack his truck and head north, chasing the ghost of a friendship he'd lost, and maybe, just maybe, the man he used to be before fear made a coward of his conscience. Tonight, though, he would sit with his daughter and watch the stars come out over land that no longer belonged to him but would always be home. Some journeys, he was learning, began with an ending, and some endings were just another word for hope. The Montana sky stretched endless and clean above Jake's truck as he pulled into the dirt driveway of the Broken Creek Ranch. 6 months after signing his life away on courthouse steps that seemed a lifetime behind him, the mountains rose like cathedral spires in the distance, and the air tasted of pine and possibility and something he'd almost forgotten existed: peace. Tommy was in the corral, working a young horse with the same quiet patience Jake remembered from their boyhood. 20 years of hard time had changed his face, carved lines of endurance and loss. But his hands on the reins were gentle as prayer, his voice soft as Sunday morning. "Figured you'd show up eventually," Tommy said without turning around, like Jake's arrival was as natural as sunrise. "Coffee's on the stove. Help yourself." They worked in silence for the next hour, Jake finding his rhythm with the ranch chores like he'd never left this life behind. The oil money had bought him freedom, but freedom wasn't the same thing as purpose. And purpose was something a man had to earn with sweat and honesty, and the willingness to show up when showing up was hard. When the work was done, they sat on the porch of Tommy's small cabin, drinking coffee and watching the sun sink behind peaks that had stood long before their troubles began and would stand long after their names were forgotten. "Emma's doing good with the ranch," Jake said eventually. "Got herself engaged to a veterinarian from Austin. Good man, from what I hear. That's fine news." Tommy's voice carried genuine warmth. "Sarah would be proud." "Yeah, she would." Jake set down his coffee cup, the weight of unfinished business settling between them like dust after a long ride. "I'm sorry, Tommy, for all of it. For the cowardice, for the silence, for the 20 years you lost because I was too weak to be the friend you deserved." Tommy nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the mountains. "Sorry's a good word, Jake, but it ain't magic. Can't change what was, can't bring back what's gone. Then what can it do? It can be the start of something new, something better." Tommy stood up, walked to the edge of the porch where wildflowers grew in untended beauty. "You know what I learned in prison? Time doesn't heal wounds, but choosing to live past them, that's something different entirely." Jake joined him at the railing, breathing in air so clean it made his chest ache. Below them, the ranch spread out like a promise, modest but honest, worked by men who understood that second chances came with a price, and that price was the willingness to be better than you were before. "I'd like to stay," Jake said, "if you'll have me. Not looking for forgiveness or absolution or anything fancy. Just partnership. The kind we should have had all along." Tommy was quiet for so long that Jake thought he'd misread the moment, mistaken tolerance for welcome. But then his oldest friend smiled, the first real smile Jake had seen from him since they were boys chasing dreams across endless summer pastures. "Mike could use an extra hand around here. Pays in beans and honesty, and the work's harder than oil money. Sounds like exactly what I need." They shook hands on it, their grips firm and sure. Two old cowboys who'd learned that the hardest trails sometimes led to the sweetest meadows. In the distance, a nighthawk called, and Jake thought about Emma and her veterinarian, about Sarah's smile when she'd said yes to his proposal all those years ago, about the long road between broken and whole. The oil derricks were still pumping back in Texas, still pulling wealth from ground that had belonged to his family for 100 years. But here in Montana, under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, Jake McCready had finally found something more valuable than money, more lasting than land, more precious than pride. He'd found his way home to the friendship he'd nearly destroyed. And in that friendship, he'd found himself again, not the man he'd been before the fear and the lies, but the man he'd always had the choice to become. Some journeys end where they began, and some men learn that the longest distance between 2 points is the space between who you are and who you could be. But for those brave enough to travel that distance, the view from the other side is worth every hard mile.